Welcome, everyone. My name is Irina Ristarchova, and on behalf of the Digital Studies Institute and DISCO Network, I'm really happy to present our public event today, the book talk, Discriminating Data, Wendy Chun in conversation with Lisa Nakamura and Alex Barnett. I am professor and acting director of the Digital Studies Institute that is hosting this talk. And our co-sponsors for today's event are the following units at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor: Asian Pacific Islander, American Studies, English Language and Literature, American Culture, Communications and Media, and the STEM School of Art and Design. Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan provides space for scholars of the humanities and qualitative social sciences who are experts in digital studies and supports their research and teaching. We're the nation's first one-stop place for all things digital, including digital media studies, digital humanities, digital pedagogy, digital art, aesthetic practice and design, and critical thinking about the digital future. As you can see, the digital studies is a big tent for us that has always included practitioners, critics, theorists, and artists. We are also a national leader in the study of digital media and race, gender, and identity. The next slide, please. Before I go into the DISCO network, I would, if Veronica, if you could put the previous slide in. I forgot to mention here that we have a postdoctoral fellowship applications open. They are due on January 7th, 22, and they are advertised currently at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I'm putting in the link right here. So please, for those of you who are interested and just gotten your doctorate in area that's related to the digital studies, check it out. The next slide, please. The Digital Studies Institute is a proud home of the DISCO network, which is an amazing digital inquiry, speculation, collaboration, optimism network led by Lisa Nakamura, and you will hear more about it in a second. Next slide, please. Upcoming DISCO events include digital methodology workshop with Andre Brock, Met Frictions workshop series with Remy Yargo. And from the Digital Studies Institute, we have an event on December the 9th, Welcome to the Indigenous Future. And our Digital Ideas Summer Institute will be devoted to critical access, technology and disability justice in summer of 2022. I welcome you also to wait for applications and apply, and we will be happy to see you here in Ann Arbor in the summer 2022 when the weather will be fabulous. The next slide, please. And here it's my pleasure to introduce bios of our speakers today. Wendy Hui Kyong Chun is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media and leads the Digital Democracies Institute. She has been professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, where she worked for almost 2 decades. She has also been a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and she has held fellowships from the Guggenheim, ACLS, American Academy of Berlin, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Lisa Nakamura is the Gwendolyn Calvert Baker Collegiate Professor of American Culture and Digital Studies at the University of Michigan. She is the author of several books on race, gender, and the internet. She is the founding director of the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan and the lead PI for the DISCO network. Next slide, please. Alex Barnett is group leader for numerical analysis at the Center for Computational Mathematics at the Flatiron Institute, a division of the sameness Foundation in New York City. His PhD was in physics at Harvard University, followed by postdoctoral work in radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and in applied mathematics at the Koran Institute at NYU. He then taught at the Department of Mathematics at Dartmouth College for 12 years, becoming a full professor in 2017. His research interests include computational partial differential equations, waves, fast algorithms, internal equations, neuroscience, imaging, statistics, and inverse problems. He has published more than 50 papers, received several grants from the National Science Foundation, won the 21 International Physics Olympiad, and received Dartmouth's Karen Wetterhahn Memorial Award for distinguished creative or scholarly achievement. I personally look forward to hearing today how Alex's work contributed to this Wendy's book. The next slide, please. And here I'm leaving you with hearing more about the DISCO network, Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, Optimism Network. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
I can talk a little bit about the DISCO network. It stands for Digital Inquiry, Collaboration, Speculation, and Optimism. And there are 6 of us who are in this network and started it. It's me, Andre Brock, Catherine Knight-Steele, Rayvon Fouché, Stephanie Dinkins, and Remy Yurgo. And we have a 3-year period during which we are hoping to write, teach, and do some cool research on the intersections between disability, race, and technology. So I'm just going to dive right in. I'm so excited to be talking to Wendy and later her co-author, Alex, about this new book, Discriminating Data, from MIT Press. And I'm hoping to get at what this book is contributing to the field, which is a lot. So in recent years, we've seen quite a few critiques of the tech industry. Wendy and I, as we were saying before, both remember when there was a lot of utopian optimism, and it seems that there is a kind of backlash to that. But I think what the field and what the conversation is missing is both nuance and history around this question, you know? So this book, Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods, and the New Politics of Recognition, provokes us to think about data in a new way. And it's beautifully written, beautifully researched. It has some fascinating exercises that are very interactive, which I've never seen in a critical book like this before, which we'll talk about a little more. But I wanted to ask Wendy some things about the title. So Discriminating Data is a title that can go in lots of ways, and that's one thing I love about it. So if you read it as being about data as the subject, data playing a role in creating new kinds of social discrimination against and systemic denial of resources to marginalized groups, which I feel now we know is true, right? That's not even that controversial, but it was quite controversial a while ago. The data itself is an agent in creating discrimination against people, specifically people of color, women, and so on. The data is an agent that makes discrimination happen, and that we know discrimination is wrong. So that's one way to read it. And I think if we look at it another way, we can see discriminating data is something that we as humans can do. The data isn't all the same. If we learn through critical theory, critical thinking, maybe a little bit of math, I'm hoping not too much math because that part I need some help with, but I know we're going to get some help with, that if we see us as possibly being able to discriminate between not only data which discriminates and data that maybe doesn't discriminate as much, but if we can learn to see somehow the inner workings and really important distinctions between different kinds of data, right? Personal data, data about our face, data about our name, data about our race and gender, and understand what kinds of things people are doing when they're making data. Can we see through data and what is being done with it? Can we have some agency to know, and I think that's what the tutorials in the book are about, to empower ourselves, to know how data is discriminating, not just against us possibly, but creating new kinds of discrimination, maybe even new ways of being discriminatory that used to be invisible to us. And something I love about this book is that in our field, we do a lot of gesturing towards discrimination, but only as an effect, right? That I know I was denied credit. I know that I didn't get to see what my friends saw because I'm a woman, because I'm Black, right? Or because I'm Asian. But the how is not always that easy for us to get at. So in some ways, we're all grabbing different parts of the elephant. You know, we know that data is discriminatory, but we don't know how we can discriminate ourselves about how data is discriminatory and what it's doing, not just to me, but to people I care about. And as Wendy says, people we care about are in some ways the problem, right? That people we care about are people who are like us oftentimes. They're our neighbors. Sometimes we care about our neighbors, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we recognize people we care about as being like us. In a more ideal scenario, we could recognize people who aren't like us, but are machines able to recognize that? And what are the implications of that? So I think in the first case, we could think of data as something which is doing things to us. And in the second, we can hopefully see ourselves as people who can discriminate when we look at data, if we get to look at it and not just feel like objects. So I'm going to invite Wendy to talk about method, because I was so compelled by the way this book draws its conclusions. What this book is doing to me is to create new origin stories for how we got here. So I think it's really easy to blame companies for being bad, and that is not even necessarily true, but it doesn't tell us anything about the how. So, you know, we're kind of swimming in algorithmically curated news, facial recognition systems, social media. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with those things. But Wendy, I think, cuts right to the heart when she writes, big data is the bastard child of psychoanalysis and eugenics. So I wanted to invite her to talk about this alternative genealogy that in some ways pushes a lot against this focus on famous men and what they did wrong, because that's not really getting us anywhere. So we used to think, you know, Norbert Wiener, Vannevar Bush, all those people we teach in intro classes were good, and then we thought they were bad, right? And this is not a history which is very fruitful. So in this book, Wendy, you spent a lot of time looking in unfamiliar places. So not at MIT, not at Silicon Valley, but rather at housing developments in the 50s, you know, different kinds of racialized and gendered places where we don't necessarily look. So can you talk more about how you found and selected the kind of new origin story in eugenics and physiognomy to understand, say, network science and facial recognition technology, why it matters where we get our histories from, and what new light this sheds on people doing work on, say, race, but not necessarily technology, or looking at, say, gender, but not necessarily the history of data science. So that's a long question, but I just wanted to invite you to talk about how you did this and what you were doing when you did it.
So this is Wendy. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your summary and your incredible question. I'm so thrilled to be here in conversation with you and the Disco Network. So this is a huge question, and so I'm gonna answer it in several different ways. The first is, one thing that was important for me in terms of methodology and stories that we tell is to move away from the idea that if we only added humanities and social sciences to technology, then we would have ethical tech. So the problem is that we don't have social science or humanities interests in these, that these are purely technical, and that's what's wrong. Because as I started reading more and more about how these concepts became axiomatic, notions like similarity breeds connection or homophily, which is what you mentioned earlier, Lisa, what became so key is that these were borrowings from social sciences and the humanities. So the issue isn't that the social sciences and humanities aren't there, but that concepts have been borrowed poorly, or poor concepts have been borrowed. And so part of what's needed is a richer, more interdisciplinary engagement where we're not just taking each other's methods poorly from each other, but understanding the weight of what it means to work with these concepts. And so what I always do, and this comes, I think, from my background both in engineering and in English literature, is always to start with a basic concept. And to ask myself, how did this come to be? And also to try to think through the very different and often conflicting meanings there are for any one concept, so such as control, freedom, etc. And what became so important for me when I was looking at these axiomatic concepts, and the first one I start off is with correlation, right? So the beginning of the 21st century, you heard about correlation all the time, right? This was what was different about big data. This was what was different about knowledge. It was, let us take over the future, not the past. What I found really odd about that is that the rhetoric around correlation was almost the same rhetoric that happened a century earlier when eugenicists came up with the concept of correlation. And why the rhetoric was so eerie is that both eugenicists and people talking about big data were talking about correlation not as a way to understand or think statistically about the past, but rather to understand how to determine the future once you've determined things in the past and the present that do not change. And so that for me was absolutely key in trying to think through why and how is correlation as this future predictor, this way to close the future, which is what eugenics thought to do, coming back, but now in the name of disruption. So if what we're undergoing is disruption, it's not because something radically new is happening and the future can be anything, but rather because the future is being closed through this logic. And so for me, going back to the eugenicists and trying to understand what's different, though, about how they used correlation and thought about correlation and society and us was also key. Because for eugenicists, they believed that their population was the nation as a whole, right? And so they had very disturbing notions of uplift. Whereas now with the new correlation, it's being used to divide communities, and what's being touted are certain forms of exit, rather than like communal exit, rather than this national uplift. And that has everything to do with questions of race, and how race and difference is being thought through. And so the ways in which homophily, which is the idea that similarity breeds connection, has become this default concept. And so the second chapter looks at homophily, and as you noted, it comes from studies of housing projects, biracial housing projects. And so in a bizarre way, by using the notion homophily, what we're doing is spreading segregation through these networking concepts, right? So segregation isn't an accident, it's the default. But what was also very key to me was to go back to these studies and to see, like, even back then, homophily wasn't the only choice. And that if you go back to the ways in which these concepts themselves were formulated, you can think through other possibilities and understand how the amplification of certain types of relations are destroying others. So just very briefly with homophily, what was so key is that this came from a housing study that came in the 1940s. It was when there was incredible income compression, also a real housing crisis. And the question was, what should we do? Should we have more public housing? And back then public housing was mainly white. Or should we have private housing? Should we have mortgages? And we know what happened, and we know the incredible wealth disparity that has resulted from the decision that was made. But back then they said, okay, so let's study these housing projects. One housing project was an all-white co-op, and the other one was a biracial housing project. And they asked every member of the families of these groups questions, like these were 4-hour interviews. And so this was blatantly forms of social engineering and of sociological surveillance. They talked about this as a laboratory. This is why housing projects were so interesting, because they were forms of social engineering. So that idea of an enclosure in engineering, which has now become, of course, the way people describe social networks, was there from the very concepts that were drawn from. And thinking through these enclosed communities, therefore opens up these historical narratives.
Yeah, something I love about the way you write this book is that it's very precise, but there's also some very accessible, kind of memorable writing in here. And one of them is, how do you show a love of the same by running away when others show up? So I think, as you say, right, the idea add social science, add humanities, and stir doesn't get at the root issue here, which is the way these things, including social science and the humanities, are put together to create forms of discrimination. So how do we know when we run away? How do we know when we are allowed to stay, right? And I'm interested in how that maps onto, say, ethnic studies or women's studies, which are in some ways, as you say, structured around what you call the productive conflicts that in some ways are antithetical to data science, right? Because data science wants to fix something as having a nature and then perform a bunch of operations based on that nature, which can be mistaken. You know, people think if we just clean the data, maybe it won't be so racist. But I think what you're saying with this origin story, it doesn't really matter how much you clean this data, right? It's instead about the kind of premises of what data is, and what conflict is and how conflict should be dealt with in a network, right? So are we going to run away when others show up? And if not, what are we going to do? So this is a big question, but I'm just going to ask it since I think people would love to know from a kind of data science and also critical perspective, what you think, given this is a kind of poisoned well to begin with, but your history, but certainly, you know, my research, when I think about what I've been trying to do too, is to say, how can something based on, say, the labor of Indigenous women making our stuff not produce discrimination? You know, it's invisible. We don't know where that stuff came from, but that is itself part of the problem, that the origins of things are mistaken. You know, the wrong kind of people, not the wrong kind of people, but certain bodies are getting a lot of credit, good and bad, for having created the digital, and others are totally excluded in many ways. So I'm going to transition to a question about dirty data. Because you're right, machine learning programs are not only trained on selected, discriminatory, and often dirty data, they are verified as true only if they reproduce these data, right? In other words, as you say, they predict the past, not the future, which makes sense that you're going to, you know, that eugenics is at the heart of these things. So your Lombroso pictures, right, of facial recognition, I've been waiting for someone to do that for a long time and to say, you know, this is completely old. This was dirty data too, right? These drawings of Jewish noses or of Asian eyes are completely dirty data, but we just didn't call them that back then. So this is a theme throughout your book. As you write, social networks create and spawn the reality they imagine. They become self-fulfilling prophecies. So how do you interrupt this repetition of the same? Big question, but I had to ask you.
Thank you, Lisa. So Wendy here again. I think that what's absolutely key in the question that you asked is there's two parts to it, right? One is the question of dirty data, or what I would call deep fakes, right? So what I argue is that deep fakes aren't just the product of these programs, they're actually the ground truth, right? These either corrupted police files, Hollywood celebrities as the basis for facial recognition, training, etc. What we have is the problem that the deep fake has become ground truth, so what's replicated as true is this deep fake, right? But the other argument is, even if we fix the deep fake, you'll still have reproduction of a certain ground truth as what is true. And part of this is because, when these programs are trained, what they're verified against, right, to see if they're predicting things correctly, isn't future values, but rather certain values that have been held back during the training process, and they're usually from the same data set, or they're out of sample data. Right? And so one thing that's fundamentally that we need to think through is this definition of truth as repetition. Because if truth is repetition, then only racist, and society is racist, and the ground truth that is based on is this deep, fake racist past, then these things will only be verified as correct if they make racist predictions. So one of the largest things that I put out there is that we need other forms of verification, validation, and truth. And this is why we need to have an interdisciplinary dialogue. Because definitions of truth within the humanities and philosophy, for instance, don't rely simply on repetition. I mean, Hannah Arendt famously said, if truth becomes repetition, then it becomes nothing, right? And people always, experience things like films or novels that feel profoundly true, even though they are fictional. So I think that these larger questions of truth are absolutely key, but they also therefore don't mean that truth is something absolutely unreproducible, but it gets us to things even like first principle and the relationship between first principles and truth. So for example, if you have this mindset that, what is true is what's reproducible, if you think about global climate change, you're absolutely screwed, right? Because you have to wait for global climate change to happen, therefore you can verify it as true. You've lost the battle. And I think global climate change models make absolutely clear the difference between what's true and what's correct.
Yeah, I think that's awesome because it really encourages other scholars to try and find data that doesn't fit into this received story, right? As you say in another section of this book, the internet has become nothing but social experimentation to normalize the non-normative. So I love this kind of invitation to normalize or to think about how the non-normative can be disruptive here. So, and that's the kind of project of this alternative historiography, I think, that you and other people as well have been doing. And I'm super fascinated by what you say is democracy equals offense, because I'm very offended all the time by the internet. I feel like that's my job. And I hear in what you're saying as well that data is doing a great job discriminating against us, but we're not doing a super great job discriminating data. And this book is part of that project. So I wanted to invite Alex, who is a collaborator of yours, to speak to how his contribution is going to help us do that. I mean, I'm a humanist. I totally don't know anything about math. So I'm hopeful that you can speak more to how what you were thinking to help people who are like me learn to do a better job.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you. It's Alex here. That's a tough question. So I think our goal of the collaboration with Wendy was to put together tools to understand what's going on in a way that hasn't been done before, like where you actually see a basic sort of scientific and equations and graphs and pictures understanding of the methods alongside, well, I mean, I'm just adding that onto Wendy's sort of in-depth history of where these ideas came from. And it's invariably fascinating, like how tied up with the some of sort of scary social science history that the math is, and that you don't even, that's not taught. If you go through a master's in data science and then you go out into the real world and get hired by a million companies to sell, to control their marketing algorithms or whatever. I mean, this is the story of tens of thousands of graduates all trying to get those jobs right now. They are not taught, like, I mean, for instance, the history of linear discriminant analysis, which I sort of had, was really shocked when I dug into that and learned that, and we sort of put this in the book. So I'll hold up the section just to cue those of you who have the book. But that this method was literally made in order to separate and segregate the different castes as the British Empire saw them in India. And that led to this method, but then it's like now a totally standard method in statistics and data analysis. And it's the first thing you would learn if you want to classify pictures of cats and dogs and all of the things that big data lets you do. So part of it is just to put the two together. I mean, normally you'd read a history book, you'd read a statistics book, and they would rarely talk to each other. So does that help solve the problems? I think you have to be informed on both sides about literally what the algorithms are doing, the sort of operations, the formulae, and then what they can lead to and where they came from. And then you have other team members that can really help with this, like journalists and then and computer scientists and a whole teams of people that are questioning the ethics of how these algorithms, what they end up doing to people.
Yeah, something I really resonated with reading this book is the idea of the AI apocalypse, because it was longed for and then it was feared and people still talk about it. I feel like it happened a while ago and we're more or less just getting our head around that or starting to recognize that it's already happened. And now what are we going to do? So in the conclusion, you urge the reader to prevent this, or rather not to prevent it, but like try to engage it by doing machine unlearning. So as you were saying, Alex, it might be learning more about the colonial logics of these machines as a way to unlearn what the results might mean for us. In other words, to create a different future, not to repeat all the time. So what are some specific things that we might consider doing in our everyday life to enact machine unlearning?
That's a great question, Lisa, and there's so many different ways to think about it depending on who you are and what your everyday life looks like. I think that the term unlearning, of course, comes from Ariella Azoulai's work on potential history. And what she encourages us to do in terms of unlearning the archive is to move away from treating people as sources of information, but rather instead treat them as companions. And so one thing that I argue in the book is if you think through these communities that have been at the heart of this kind of analysis, so residents of biracial housing projects, and Lisa, as you and I have been looking at together, residents of Japanese American internment camps who are central to the emergence of sentiment analysis, right? What does it mean to treat these folks as companions rather than as sources of information? And what that looks like is a serious dealing with the legacies of this and to think through questions of reparations and of living with these histories. And you also mentioned the apocalypse. So what's so important for me is the argument is the fact that we have this fear of discriminatory algorithms and the fear of this AI apocalypse at the same time coming up isn't an accident. And we need to actually think these two together, because one reason why we're so afraid of the AI apocalypse is because machines are framed for us as servants. As slaves. They're profoundly raced and gendered, right? So Jenny Rhee has written about this. Of course, you've talked about the labor practices as well. So to take on these issues, we need to take on these questions of labor, the framing of these machines, and how we want to relate to them. And here, this is why I think Indigenous studies is so important. And they've written texts like the Making Kin with Our Machine, that's Jason Lewis et al.'s really important contribution, as well as the AI Indigenous Protocol. And what's so key about that in terms of thinking about apocalypses that have been, I mean, one thing that's really clear within Indigenous studies is that the apocalypse has already happened. And trying to engage with what remains and what sort of relationality is fundamental. So I think that's one thing, like start thinking through these entire relations that are part of your engagement and what is your relationship to that is a fundamental relationship. I think that the other thing that us as citizens and as people need to think about is not simply, you know, is this technology good or bad, but what is it amplifying? How is it amplifying? And also, what are the root issues that are being brought up by these? So to ask ourselves, okay, instead of saying, okay, this risk recidivism program discriminates against racial minorities, we need to fix it, right? We have to realize actually that this thing is operating exactly as it should, and what it's revealing is that the criminal justice system is discriminatory. So one thing that we need to do is to take these results and then say, like, global climate change models show us what's wrong with the world or what the future will look like if we keep doing X, Y, and Z, to take these results as cautionary tales and say, okay, then if we don't want this future, then we've got to change the way the criminal justice systems operates. We've got to think through these questions of injustice and just to be very engaged in what these are doing. But Alex.
All I would add is that, yes, the apocalypse, I think, began for me sort of when you think about some a very simple corporate construction, namely the discount card, right? In the old days, right, I think people understood capitalism. If you go to a store and you buy something, well, the store wants to sell you things, and they want you to buy as much as possible. I mean, that can be hyper-capitalistic, but at least everyday person understands what the goal is of the company. It's to sell you some stuff. And okay, so then we get good at looking at ads and understand sort of media literacy at that level is important. But when you get a discount card, that's sort of the first level where the consumer starts to become a source of data. And that even happened, you know, in the 80s, before the internet, before we started hooking all of the computers together and things went terribly wrong, right? So now it's like that on steroids. We have the interaction you think you're having with a company is actually nothing like what is going on. Like, you think with Facebook, you think you're getting a free service that is kind of fun and you can share information, you know, be social, okay. But what the company thinks is going on is, and what is actually going on is that you're generating data, immense amount of personal information that is then sold to advertisers. And that kind of media literacy, we need to sort of teach this to everybody. And in a sense, then you have to understand the algorithms too, as well as what they're doing. And I don't know, I guess that's where I think, that's why I think we have an apocalypse. It's not capitalism, it's that people haven't, that the companies have been very good at actually telling us a different story about what's happening from what's really happening. I sound paranoid now, but
no, that's such a good example. You think you're getting a free loaf of bread, but you're really not. Instead, you're giving something. I'm thinking of Greg Elmer's book, Profiling Machines, that came out in 2003. That's about discount cards in Canada. I remember reading this and thinking, wow, people should really be more concerned about free beer, because
yes,
there really isn't such a thing. Okay, I think we have a few more minutes before we want to open it up to questions from people here. Did you want to expand on any things that came up, or answer a question I didn't ask yet?
Well, I hope we will bounce ideas around for what can be done concretely for new either social platforms or laws, you know, on the legal standpoint, things like Section 230, and then making companies admit that they are media companies, not platforms. This kind of stuff. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what maybe people will ask about that. Those kind of steps.
Yeah. Can I ask what you're doing?
Me, right?
Yeah. Well, no, not this very second, but your practice is generally informed by what you know around how data is being deployed.
Well, I mean, I'm mostly a mathematics researcher and working on algorithms that help solve science problems rather than social problems, I would say. So I mean, this is a new venture for me, but by being inspired by Wendy's work and talking to her over the years, and so I mean, I don't have like a personal project on this. I just try and follow what's going on to discuss. And I mean, I have been involved, for instance. I mean, one idea that counters the hegemony, the homophily concept that's so central to this book, to Wendy's ideas, is that you shouldn't group people together by what they like or who they are, or that you should randomize. So that the opposite of segregation is randomization. And I have been involved in student housing, where, similar to this housing project work, for instance, the fraternity system at a place I used to teach is all about hierarchy and segregation, and we really tried to fight to remove that system. And then you would have one based on people being placed with people who are different from them, and then they have to talk to each other. And I think that's one of the main ways progress can occur, is people who are different sharing ideas.
I should have framed my question differently. I was thinking whether you thought we should quit Facebook, like that kind of thing. Because people, when they get a data scientist, want to know, should I quit Twitter? Should I quit Facebook? Should I use my credit card? Like, it becomes very kind of embodied of, I always have this feeling I'm doing something wrong when I post an Instagram picture, when I tag somebody. So I was wondering if you had any opinions about that. I mean, it may be, as this book kind of sketches out, that it's already such a systemic issue that that may not matter very much in the big picture.
All I'll say is I think we have to educate in a sort of new form of media literacy that teaches the kind of things Wendy discusses, so that if you do post a picture, you know what's happening and why the company wants you to post a picture.
Right.
And, that maybe that. And I happen to deplatform from Facebook and really enjoyed that extra 20 minutes a day that I got. But that's not, I mean, there's going to be other things. Maybe we should have platforms that you actually pay a little money for, a little like the telephone. In the old days, I mean, AT&T was a big, nasty monopoly, but at least you were the customer and you were paying for a service that was in order to make a call to somebody else. Now, who is the customer? Well, it's not you anymore. It's the advertising. It's the businesses who advertise. It's totally flipped around. And if people could be aware of that when they use the platform, I think that would help a lot.
Right. Yeah. I think looking at the kind of worksheet, tutorial parts really helped me understand why deepfakes is the kind of new stereotype, right? Or the new model, that when things look like each other, they're just much easier for machines to deal with them. They become preferred, right? So some of the pictures in here of faces that all look the same, and then the math kind of explaining why that's preferred, really helped me understand why some faces aren't seen as faces and some people aren't seen as people. Okay, so I think it's time to open it up. So let's see if there's any questions from people who are here. I'm sure there are some awesome questions. I look at the chat, I'm like, oh, this is an amazing group of people. Yeah, I will look at the chat and see what's going on here. Okay, so we already have a really interesting couple questions. What does a meaningful collaboration between computer scientists and humanities scholars look like in practice? Uniquely qualified people to answer. And what does an ethical AI look like for me, Wendy, and Alex?
So why don't I start with the first question? This is Wendy. So I think that what a meaningful collaboration looks like, I'll start with an example that draws from my own experience. And so at one point at Brown, when the new president came in, she said, we want faculty-led initiatives. But of course, part of this was to put the faculty together who were going to then initiate projects. And so I was put together with the head of computer science and somebody in biostats who worked on AIDS. And we looked at each other and we said, well, we're not going to work together unless there's a problem that we know we can't solve on our own. So in other words, why do we all need to be at this table? What is the question we can't solve? And the question that we came up with, which was initiated from the person in biostats, was I can show almost any correlation to be real. I can show almost anything to exist, but I don't know what's true. I don't know what matters. And then the other question that was initiated from some of my work around global climate change models is, just because something is true doesn't mean that it will inspire action. So what is that relationship between truth and action? And so we called it DIAL, the Data Inference Action Loop. It wasn't one of the ones that were chosen, but it became a model for me of interdisciplinary work that happens. And it starts when we all have a question that we're interested in, that we want to solve, and we know we can't do it on our own. And then we work with others because they're different, which means respecting their methodology, but it also means questioning their first principles and having our first principles questioned in turn. And so that's what the Digital Democracy Institute is all about, is to take the hard problems that face us, from disinformation to abusive language to network segregation, bring together humanists, data scientists, network scientists, people in the arts and the social sciences, and to say, okay, this is how we've approached this problem, but it remains. Why does it remain? And so how can we use some of these roadblocks as opportunities for intervention? And to be as concrete as possible, our project on misinformation and disinformation, for example, starts from the fact that fact-checking is absolutely important, but it's not enough. Like, over and over again, people pointed out that fact-checking can actually spread stories to different audiences. Some people spread stories they find compelling, whether or not they're correct. And if you think through the 2016 election, what's so key is that not only was it called the fake news election, it was called the authenticity election. And the person who won scored high on both. And so rather than saying, okay, this is a post-truth era and putting our hands up, we say, well, actually, what's happening here? So instead of saying, okay, why is any piece, like, how is this correct or incorrect, ask ourselves, why and how does anything come to feel true, irregardless of its facticity? And what is that relationship between feeling true or authentic and facticity? And here, we've been drawing from theater and performance studies and literary studies, which has done, a ton of work around questions of authenticity, and trying to understand that relationship between authenticity and authority, truth and trust, fact and things that were done. And so starting from what seems to be an absolute roadblock, but then using every discipline and where each discipline is broken to draw from another discipline to push the question further.
Did you want to add anything, Alex?
I'll just give an example of another. I mean, other than Disco and Wendy's wonderful institute, there is amazing stuff happening at Tufts University from a mathematician called Moon Duchin, who has the redistricting project there. And she brings together trained computer scientists, lawyers, social scientists, and political scientists to attack redistricting and really try and create expert witnesses that then can testify. And this really connects to the legal system. And I think so. Regulation is part of what an ethical AI has to be. The algorithms have to be available for examination, and even if you have to sue it out of, the government has to squeeze it out of corporations. It's going to be very difficult, but they may have to pass tests that maybe we could devise such tests. So I don't know. I'll probably just leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, here's a great question about truth.
Lisa, before we do this, Lisa,
yes.
They also asked you what you thought ethical AI looked like. I know that you've been thinking through the limitations of this.
Yeah. Well, just to take a little piece of it, I realize I quoted you incorrectly a little bit ago around democracy and offense, because in this book, you write how toxicity and racism are baked into these social media platforms as proof of concept of network is diverse. So if people are basically being really racist to each other and, you know, horrible, and nothing is happening in return, that's kind of proof of concept that democracy is working. So, you know, there's some statistics, which I believe that only 3% of hate speech is ever called out in any way, right? Much less regulated, meaning people actually losing access to accounts or even being permanently banned. 3%, which seems high to me. I forget where I got this from, is the paper or something. So, you know, it's incentive to make us this big racism machine as evidence that democracy is working, because democracy is about people getting to do what they want, and the evidence of doing what you want is doing something someone else doesn't want. So that to me is anti-ethical AI. You know, it's the basic principle you're writing about here, that is only going to make more of the same as people get more concerned about the apocalypse. Like democracy, America, we have to preserve it. We must have more racism as evidence that we're preserving it even more vigorously than before, which obviously I'm against. But having read this book, I can see how that gets defended, you know, and how, as there was an article in the Post not long ago that Tarleton Gillespie cited, that shows that Facebook was actually regulating anti-white racism much more rigorously than anti-Black racism, right? Because they had decided that made more sense and was probably, you know, optimal. I mean, who knows? Which is the opposite of ethical, right? It's anti-ethical AI. So seeing how these ways of kind of, I would say, reproducing racism are obviously incentivized by companies, like that has to happen. That has to stop. And I'm not sure exactly how it has to stop, but reading this book has made me see why it's happening that way, right? And why there's so much disincentive for companies to do anything about it. So there's a question here about truth, which I feel like I have to ask because it speaks to this question of authenticity, which is core to this book, right? So the question of why we have to see people's personal, really unpleasant details, as you write, is evidence of something different from truth, which is identity, authenticity. People being real often means embarrassing themselves or others, or suffering a lot of shame because of personal details coming out, right? So there's a request here for you to speak about the differences between true, correct, authentic, and real, and how these subtle terminologies are part of a new model for media literacy.
Thanks, that's a great question. And I would also point that there's a lot of people working on this. And so I think that Sarah Benet-Weiser's work on authenticity has been fantastic. I think that the work that Alex Juhasz and Ganel Langlois and Nishant Shah have done around really fake is important. And the Beyond Verification project is a large international collaboration. So in terms of the relationship between what's authentic, true, correct, and what was the third term?
I think it was real.
Real, yeah.
As in real ID.
As a real ID. Yeah, those are so important. And I think that one way to think through those and the differences between those and the resonances they make is to go exactly with the example you started with, Lisa, which is how this call for us to be authentic, where the idea is we become transparent, our insides and outsides coincide, not because we're being sincere, not because we're being good people, but rather because we're exposing something nasty about ourselves or other people, and therefore showing that we have nothing to hide, right? And that this concept of authenticity is so valuable because this open secret about ourselves, this nothing to hide about ourselves that we decide to parade as a way to say we're authentic is often those divisive legs that are really effective in terms of clustering people within network neighborhoods, right? And so this is being weaponized and used against us. And what's so key is that authenticity shares the same root as author and as authoritarian. So it's always linked to this question of verification and certain notions of authority. against this, or in relationship, would be the question of what is true, where truth comes from, the same word as trust. And here, I think that the work that's been done in history of science by Stephen Shapin and others has been actually crucial to showing how it was only in the 18th century that this notion of truth emerged, that equaled what is quote unquote correct, right? And what he points out is it's actually a bunch of dudes in the 18th century within science trying to claim certain modes of truth, right? Saying that these experiments could be reproduced, but they couldn't be, right? But the question was, how does one learn to trust certain infrastructures so that what is being produced is considered to be valid, right? And so I think that thinking through the relationship between truth and trust, not in a cynical way, but to actually understand that truth and trust are intimately intertwined is crucial to thinking through why it is you trust something. That this thing isn't like, so again, what I think is so important is not to say the issue is that people have become cynical or distrustful, because democracy is based on people questioning things. The problem isn't that people question CNN, it's that questioning of CNN then leads to trust of Epoch Times. So it's not the fact that people question, it's where they land in this like trust of even more dubious sources that we need to think through. And I think that the idea of constantly questioning, this literacy of constantly questioning, so you don't land somewhere, is absolutely key, and trying to think through structures of trust. In terms of what's real of course is race. It's a thing, right? It gets us to all sorts of questions about how these things emerge and how we consider them to relate to others. And I think that starting from those differences is really key, because it moves us away from saying, again, this is post-truth, this is postmodernism, blah, 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 as if this was new, but rather getting us to think through these moments of trust and authority and why it is that we expose these things when we do and how we do them.
Alex, did you want to add anything to it?
Well, I'm just reminded of the old Gary Larson cartoon that shows the dog typing on the computer saying, "Nobody knows you're a dog on the internet." That's sort of the essence, you know. They knew this has been. There's a cat and mouse game, not to mix too many animal metaphors, going on. Actually, I sort of had fun illustrating this with the Bayesian spam filters, which is a sort of well-known, even Web 1.0 example of, or even pre-web, right? Email hacking competition that's sort of going on. Can you get people to click on emails that sell you something, and or to give away your money, or just get something in front of your eyeballs that you didn't particularly think you wanted to see? So that's authenticity, and there is just this huge financial incentive. Now we have this tool of instant duplication by, you can send billions of emails with very little effort. That's what leads to sort of the danger, is the scale that this is on. In the old days, you'd have to print pamphlets and stick them on, around town or something. Now the scale in which you can fake authenticity is huge, and the amount of effort, therefore, that computer scientists are going to spend, meaning, whatever, we call them hackers, right? But maybe they're just people working for a company, are going to spend trying to fake something to get inside your soul in some way is huge, and that's it's just not happened, and that's why democracy is at such stake as well. Truth is very slippery to define, even in academia, right? With all of these studies, the recent repeats of like 100 classic social science papers, and maybe a third of them actually hold up at the level that they were originally claimed. For businesses, it's, well, it's kind of interesting. They're constantly doing A/B testing, as Wendy explains, like the multi-armed bandit. They're trying things out on us. So they're actually, the algorithms are learning truth about human behavior, but then it's not for public discussion. It's buried in an algorithm that you'll never find, that just means that this business is better at advertising than this one, and nobody will ever really know why.
Yeah.
That's a very scary situation.
Yeah, as you were talking, I thought about the corporate strategy of doubling down, which seems to be very mathematically oriented, that something that's obviously a lie can become true if you simply multiply it more.
Yes.
You know, and that is why I think these questions around authenticity, truth, and reality have become so loaded, that in some ways they come to mean their opposite. You know, the more strenuously someone asserts something is true, in some ways, the more you ought to be concerned about it. So here's a great question for people who are teaching, and even for people who are just not or taking classes, which is, what recommendations do you have for teaching current and future undergrad students who've grown up in the environment of pervasive algorithms and have no other comparison, which is our students? This just moved. I'm going to find it again. Oh, sorry. This chat is.
It's moved to AdSid.
Oh, it has it. Okay, thank you. So how do we work with students who don't have any basis for comparison? So it's not as if there was a before and after for them around before all my data was gathered and, you know, I was misrecognized in these painful ways versus the old ways. How to think skeptically about the environment, especially when it feels useful to have personalized ads or personalized recommendations. So I'm thinking especially about Spotify Wrapped, or things that are genuinely pretty joyful for people. You know, how do you put that into context? So even the things that produce pleasure and don't seem to be so bad, for people who have no other moment to remember but those moments.
I think what's key is you start with those moments. I mean, there's this view somehow that these undergrads are completely naive, that, you know, they need to be taught something before or after, as a way to get to them to think critically about what they're doing. But I think we need to respect the fact that they do think critically, and that, but to move that and start with that in different ways. So I used to teach a very large digital media class at Brown. And I would start off, it drew students from all disciplines. It was really a fun course to teach. And I would always start with the ways in which they're already using these technologies critically, right? And so back then Snap was huge. And, you know, I asked them how many people, you know, they all use Snap, how many of them actually think that these images disappear? And they all put up their hand and said they didn't think it disappeared. And I said, how many of you, regardless though, would not send me something on Snap that, and they were all like, you know. So it was trying to get to think through their practices already. I mean, if you're talking about Instagram, I mean, clearly people who are gramming understand that they're characters within this drama called big data, that what's being captured and manipulated and thought through isn't this sort of simply behaviorist knee-jerk reaction, but rather their engagement with it as characters. So I always say, like, let's think of ourselves as characters rather than marionettes, which is how, you know, the social drama presents us, because the social drama has only a behaviorist understanding of humans. Right? To go to that rich depth and gaps that we know are part of the process and say, use that as the beginning. And if we think ourselves as characters, which students completely understand immediately, you also understand that if you're a character, you have a script. You have agency, but there are ways in which things are controlled. Also, the ways in which your performance is limited. There's also the question of finance and the whole performance, et cetera, et cetera. But then I say as well, what's so key about it is that you're a character, but your actions and your script are determined by everybody else. So I get everyone then to open up their phones or think through their technology, and I say, well, the way this thing works is, and I have them open TCP/IP and do an open terminal, do TCP/IP dump, is that they then see the ways in which their card is actually sucking in everybody else's traffic and then only actively deleting what's addressed to them. So the ways in which their computer's default mode is actually what's called promiscuous mode, right? So part of what I do is get them to open up their technology and to think through their own actions and what they understand about this, and the limitations and possibilities of it when we start thinking about the ways in which Correlation, for instance, means that we're always correlated to others. So how could that be actually a place from which to intervene rather than think of ourselves as only completely manipulated?
Should I haven't actually taught such a class. I have been a professor of mathematics for many years and try to bring real world examples in. And the closest I've gotten is statistics, and you just get to see how the different presentation of statistical facts affects your feelings about them. And that's shocking to people in a math class, perhaps, you know. There's some wonderful books like Cathy O'Neill's book on weapons of math destruction that should be mentioned. Certainly eye-opener for me. It's not a math book though. It's a popular book. So I would love to know what textbooks there are that sort of bridge the gap for the undergrads. But I don't think this is fundamentally new. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, why don't we teach the undergraduates about the meat industry or some other highly processed and intricate system, that the capitalist system that's set up for our benefit, you know, supposedly for our benefit, right? But so you can buy cheap meat at the supermarket, but no one ever questions it. They're like, meat comes from the supermarket. That's the same level of engagement that many, you know, you have, you know, with Facebook, let's say. You want to like understand how is the meat grown, and the animals and the whole packaging and the distribution and the environmental effects, all of these things. You need to do the equivalent of that for social media, I think.
But also, Lisa, I know that you've been teaching and thinking through these issues. So.
Oh, wow. Like I don't know. I feel like, as you say, just because people don't remember a before doesn't mean they're super critical about now. You know, I think if anything, students are far more critical about now. And the issue for me in teaching is to kind of hold back the incredible anger and kind of rage and frustration around how this happened, and try to strategize, so work backwards and work forward. So remember where these things came from in a way that isn't just about hating or loving who we see is in charge, right? Because that's a tendency that you see in a lot of histories, which I don't think is great, because people are rarely in control of what they do. So it doesn't make sense to find victims and heroes and all that. But also thinking forward in terms of, yes, this is horrible, but let's get really creative or really off the map around what could be the difference, because at this point, there's nothing to lose by being totally unrealistic, right? Like, I think the moment for trying to be measured and thoughtful on what can we actually achieve, which I've been asking you, is a kind of red herring. You know, I think, as you say, indigenous philosophy, Afrofuturism assumes that the apocalypse has already happened. So if that's the case, kind of incremental or conservative fixes to things, you know, like me not doing Facebook or trying to get cleaner data, or let's just optimize. You can't optimize your way out of this because it's a kind of root and branch problem, right? So I think that social media companies are like, well, we're going to do a better job with moderation and hire more moderators. It does not matter how many moderators you hire at this point. Like, if every human in the US became a moderator, it would kind of be like Borges's map of the world that's the same size as the world. You know, like, in some ways, everyone is already doing the work of moderation, but they're just not doing a great job. They're just not agreeing about what that work ought to be. So I think this idea of common sense, which I've been very interested in for a long time, the moderation policy was common sense, which is to say, use your personal ideology and we will back you up. Because we've, you know, Section 230, we are not responsible. You are responsible. So I think, you know, really unfeasible solutions are very interesting in a new way to me for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, Lisa, Wendy here. I think that what is so key about what you brought up too is that we need to refuse the terms that we're given, right? So moderation makes it seem as if suddenly we're going into content, when in fact, I mean, and this is Charlton Gillespie, this is Sarah T. Roberts, etc. They've shown that it's always been moderated. It's always been shaped. So the question of moderation itself is so beside what we're trying to take on.
Right. And having AI do more of it is totally the opposite way for many of the reasons you say in your book, right? Like then you're really tripling down, quadrupling down, right? Multiplying the problem and just making it more pervasive. So I want to get some more questions because these are such good questions. So there's a question here around where a person ought to start in this book if they want to learn more around authenticity, the real and truth, and how it relates to data and everyday lives.
So the question, sorry, this is Wendy, is where to start?
Yeah, what's a good moment or a chapter that you would identify as a place for a person just starting the book to focus first?
If they were interested in questions of authenticity, then I would direct them to the chapter on authenticity, which is the 3rd chapter, which brings together studies of reality TV and training in that sense, right? Which is reality TV is all about training, and trying to think through algorithmic authenticity and the relationship between the two. So that's the 3rd chapter. I mean, the book is rather strange, just to talk about structure a little. We have these sort of meaty chapters, and then each starts with a little theoretical interlude that goes into some of the questions that were raised, as well as Alex's incredible mathematical illustrations. So I think that also having those interludes in conversation with that chapter around authenticity would be a great place to begin.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in a question about randomization that's inspired by a chat question, which has to do with the price of diversity in a way. So you were talking, Alex, about how, part of what data analytics does is to reduce randomization. So everything gets matched to something else, which is legible to that thing, which tends to reproduce different kinds of problems. This question is about the price for people, say, who are a marginalized group and who are mixed in with people who are unlike them. So, what's the human price, I guess, of heterophily or mixing when we've already created a situation that's so toxic and painful for people who are increasingly marginalized and discriminated against in everything they're doing, right? Like going to school and trying to live in a neighborhood and trying to buy stuff, right? Or get a mortgage. How do you compensate or help the people who are then having to be the random in the randomization?
That's a great question. I think what it brings out is part of the problem with homophily isn't simply that it talks about similarity breeding connection, is that it makes users and people responsible for segregation, right? So homophily becomes a synonym for discrimination, right? But it erases questions of institutional discrimination. It becomes a homonym for community that erases the real work that needs to be in place for communities to emerge. So one thing that's absolutely wrong about homophily is this notion that it's simply voluntary and produced. And so it's only, it erases questions of institutional racism, etc. Because those questions of institutional racism are also there at the question of these quote unquote solutions, which is throw in a diverse person and then suddenly it's the work of the diverse person to make everything better, right? And completely ignoring those questions of institutions in the ways that relies. And what I think is really important is if you look at these historical cases and ask yourself what could have emerged. So again, the notion of homophily actually comes from the preferences of white residents living in a biracial housing project for friends who were like them, who were liberal like them or illiberal like them, where liberal meant that you thought that housing projects should be biracial and you thought the races got along. Illiberals thought the opposite. But there was this other category called ambivalent, which thought the races shouldn't be mixed, but people got along. And then there was also the fact that they interviewed all the black residents. So to come up with the term homophily, they got rid of most of their data. They got rid of like all the black residents' responses, and they got rid of the white ambivalents, which was also the largest group, right? Because they wanted this sort of intense decision making. But if you go to some of the responses of the Black residents, they said, we're here because we're finally getting equal housing for equal money. That we're here because finally, what's being done is what's fair. And they said, we would welcome everyone here, but we're not out there to say, oh, we need a white person here to make it diverse, right? So I think that thinking through, for me, what's key is indifference, which is the ways in which you build structures of care outside of this logic of love or hate, but rather through this notion that we will have to live in difference, and we live in difference in ways that can be caring. And so that for me is absolutely key. And I know that you and I, Lisa, have been thinking through the limitations as well as this notion of heterophily, that somehow if you simply just love the opposite, this will solve everything. And it's key that, this idea of simply loving what's different is also what drives corporate models. Also what drives certain ways to quote unquote expand recommender systems.
Yeah, it's so easy to fetishize the different too, because it's pleasurable to have difference. It's stimulating and fun, and everybody likes. Alex, you wrote something. Can you read it or speak to it? Yeah, go ahead.
I did, yeah. Sorry, I kind of hit the same question on text that you were alluding to, but I mean, I would love to know more of the social science literature. I'm not an expert on that, but on the student housing, I have read quite a bit. And Elizabeth Armstrong in 2006 and her colleagues embedded themselves in a sorority, which with very homogeneous, basically a white Midwestern sorority, and studied the mechanisms where competition leads to more dangerous behavior in student life. And so I don't, on the top of my head, have a paper that shows sort of the randomization, how randomization works. But you need small communities here. You can't really say, we're going to take the whole internet and randomize everybody, because then you will get the noisiest, most racist, hate speech will still come to the top because of the way our algorithms, work. You have to build, I think, small communities that have accountability online, just like you do they work in real life, right? Human beings have been fighting the urge to form gangs that kill each other over the years, which happens, right? But you've got to try and form small groups of where there isn't a power imbalance, right? That's the other thing. You can't randomize people balanced in power. So I don't know how you do that online. Your friend group should be chosen. The people that it suggests should be complementary and rather than just more of the same.
But also, this is Wendy, to bring up ethnic studies, and you asked me about ethnic studies, and Asian American studies has done a lot of work precisely around this. What does it mean that the wound is actually also the formation of community? Like, how can we think through the psychic legacies of abuse, and how can we think through as well the ways in which care emerges in these communities, and think rigorously about them in ways that don't devalue this. And I think that thinking through those modes of care is care and power, as Alex put it, are absolutely key, as well as the deeper sort of cyclical legacies.
Well, thank you so much for writing this book. I think it's wonderful for teaching. It demystifies a lot of what computers are doing, which we can always use more of, and it's just beautifully written. So thank you both so much. And the book is available everywhere. Right? When did you want to talk more about how people can get it?
Yeah, so it's available everywhere. There is a discount code as well.
Nice.
Yes, but it's only for 10% off, and it only works in the US. And so I'm trying to find the discount code.
Well, while you're looking, I think we can also push it out through our social media in Disco and Digital Democracies. And if you love this talk, you should become involved in Disco, which is a growing network, and we want to include, of course, junior scholars. Jessica's going to say something about it.
Great. I think I just want to share a screen right now. Hi, everyone. This is Jessica Hill-Riggs speaking, and I'm the program manager of the Disco Network, which is a co-sponsor of this event. And we wanted to end this book talk by sharing more information on how to get involved in the Disco Network. Disco stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network. And we're a new research initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation that explores the intersection of identity and technology to envision a more just, equitable, anti-racist, and anti-ableist digital future. We're a consortium of 5 universities and research labs at the University of Michigan, Purdue University, Stony Brook University, and the University of Maryland College Park and Georgia Tech. And as a network, we offer fellowship opportunities, scholarly training, mentoring and publishing opportunities, and public programming such as lecture series like this one, and conferences on cutting-edge digital topics regarding identity and technology. And we'd love for you to get involved. Please visit our website, disconetwork.org, to join our listserv to learn more about our network's upcoming events and opportunities this spring and summer 2022. We're also active at Twitter at @disconetwork_. So please tweet at us, or please feel free to reach out to us via email at disconetwork@umich.edu. And thank you for joining us at this event. Have a great rest of your day. And I also just wanted to say thank you to Alan, our ASL interpreter, and to Katie for providing live captioning services. And thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I have to say, Disco is one of the most exciting things that is happening right now, so that everyone should join and participate, and that you all are going to change the world. It's phenomenal.
Oh, well, thank you, Wendy, Alex. This was amazing.
Thank you,
Thanks
Lisa.
to everybody.
Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks.